There are sounds that arrive with too much inside them, not loud sounds, not dramatic ones. The quiet kind, a song you didn't choose that began playing in another room, a voice on the street with a particular quality that stopped you mid-step, a silence that fell between two ordinary noises and suddenly weighed more than it had any right to. You didn't invite it. You didn't reach for it. It simply arrived and carried something with it, something older than the moment, something that belonged to a part of you that doesn't use language. And before you could decide whether to let it in, it was already inside you. Not in your thinking, somewhere deeper than that. That sound, whatever it was for you, was not a glitch. It was not your imagination borrowing a random stimulus and running away with it. It was a signal, and you are here right now because some part of you already knows that. You didn't find this video through a casual scroll. Something in you navigated toward it. The same part of you that received the sound, that registered the weight, that has been quietly telling you for longer than you can track that something is completing. Something is closing, not with a crash, with a precision you can almost hear if you sit still enough. Before we go further, like this video, subscribe, and drop these words in the comments. I am ready. Say them out loud as you type them. That's not performance. That's your nervous system marking the line between what was and what comes next. Because that line exists. It is real. And today, with Saturn moving backward through Aries while the moon travels through that same sign, you are standing directly on it. What the sky is doing right now is not a metaphor. It is a set of actual planetary conditions that combine into a very specific kind of pressure. The kind that doesn't ask how you feel about it. The kind that simply arrives and says, this chapter is over. Not because you decided it should be, because the cosmic structure that was holding the lesson open has finally, fully done its work. You are standing at a threshold that has a before and an after, and the remarkable thing is that your body already knows which side of it you're on. Here is what makes this portal different from every other moment you have felt something similar. You are not approaching a beginning. You are completing an ending, and completions have their own sound. A quiet one, deeper than music, arriving in the space just under thought. You have been hearing it. That's why you're here. Saturn is the planet that governs what gets built to last, not what feels good, not what we wish were true, what actually holds. When Saturn moves through a sign, it applies pressure to every false structure it finds. It is the planetary force that does not allow comfortable fictions to remain comfortable indefinitely. Where there is something unfinished, Saturn finds it. Where there is a lesson that has been approached but not genuinely completed, Saturn waits. Not cruelly. Patiently, with the specific patience of something that has all the time in the universe and is not interested in shortcuts. Aries is the sign of the self at its most primary, not the self that has been shaped by experience or softened by relationship, the original self, the one that arrived before it learned to negotiate, the raw, unfiltered core of who you are before any of it. Aries does not do subtlety. It does not do waiting for the right moment. It is the sign of the first impulse, the original direction, the instinct that precedes thought. When Saturn, the planet of permanent consequence, moves backward through this sign, something very specific happens. Everything that you have been building your identity around that was never truly yours gets reviewed. Not gently, thoroughly. Saturn retrograde is not Saturn going quiet. It is Saturn turning inward, moving its testing energy from the external world into the interior. Where Saturn direct asks, have you built something real out there? Saturn retrograde asks, have you built something real in here? It pulls the examination inside, and inside Aries that means one thing above all others. It is asking whether the self you have been presenting to the world, especially in love, especially in the connections that have cost you the most, is actually yourself, or whether it has been a version of you shaped around someone else's capacity to receive you. And then there is Neptune, sitting at 4 degrees of Aries, also moving backward. Neptune is the planet that dissolves the walls between what you feel and what you've been pretending not to feel. It is the force that makes things permeable, not in a random or chaotic way, but in the way that water finds its level, slowly, inevitably, through every gap you didn't know was there. Neptune retrograde in Aries is quietly doing something profound. It is dissolving the story you have been telling yourself about why this connection unfolded the way it did. Not the true story, the protective story, the one that was slightly more comfortable than the real one. And as that story dissolves, what remains is just the fact of what happened. Clear, unadorned, yours to finally hold without explanation. The moon is moving through Aries today as well, and it is holding hands with Neptune and forming a beautiful flowing trine with the Sun in Leo and Jupiter, also in Leo. What that means in human terms is this: the emotional body and the illuminating force of identity are in natural agreement right now. What you feel is not fighting with what you know. For perhaps the first time in a long while, the emotional truth and the rational understanding are pointing in the same direction. This is not a small thing. For someone who has spent months, perhaps years, negotiating between the heart that kept hoping and the mind that kept arriving at inconvenient conclusions, this alignment is a kind of relief the body recognizes before the mind does. This is not confusion. This is clarity wearing the face of emotion. This portal does not open for everyone moving through today. The sky is the same sky, the transits are the same transits, but not every person is positioned to receive what this particular window makes available. What it takes is not luck. It is not being the right sign, in the right house, at the right moment of life. What it takes is the quiet, unannounced standard you have held inside yourself, the one you never made a declaration about, never turned into a statement or a position or a thing you required the other person to acknowledge. You simply knew, at some level below language, what you would and would not accept. And when something fell below it, you registered that, without drama, without announcement, without needing anyone else to validate your knowing. That is not a small thing. Most people do not do that. Most people feel the falling and talk themselves out of it, construct a reason the feeling was wrong, find a context in which the behavior was understandable, decide that the standard itself was the problem. You didn't. You held the knowing quietly, privately, and let it inform your choices without requiring it to be seen. That quiet standard is the credential this moment recognizes. This portal opens for those who loved honestly when it would have been much easier to love strategically. That was not love failing. That was love being honest about what was real, about what was possible, about what was actually being offered. You received partial presence from someone who knew how to give complete attention to everything except the thing that mattered most, and you did not call it enough. Not because you were stubborn, because something in you recognized that calling it enough would have been a lie, and you were too honest for that particular lie, even when honesty was more painful than the alternative. That was not you being unworthy of receiving. That was them being unready to give. Those are not the same country. And the time, the stretches of waiting, the windows of not knowing, the long silences that arrived where resolution should have been, that was not the universe withholding. That was the universe building something in you that partial presence can no longer reach, building the ground that makes what arrives now actually receivable instead of just felt. You are not approaching this moment as someone who finally got lucky. You are arriving as someone who has been quietly, without announcement, becoming the person this moment requires. Now stay with this, because what comes next is the part that changes the meaning of everything you have been living through. The universe does not delay out of indifference. It does not allow time to pass for no reason. Every window of silence, every stretch of unresolved waiting has a specific purpose, and that purpose is never about punishment. It is about precision. The question is not why the delay happened. The question is what the delay was protecting you from. If this resolution had arrived when you first needed it, 6 months ago, a year ago, in the window when the longing was loudest, here is what would have happened. The reunion would have felt like resolution, but functioned as repetition. The dynamic would have changed its surface presentation and kept its underlying shape. The same costs, in new language. The same cycle, dressed as progress. You would have recognized the feeling of return and called it change because the longing was still louder than the pattern recognition, and you would have paid the same price twice, not knowing you had already paid it once. The silence was not their final answer. What if it was the universe's answer? Saturn governs these delays. It does not open doors until both the lesson and the person are genuinely ready, not ready as a performance, not ready as a belief, but ready as a fact that can be tested under pressure. Saturn retrograde is running that test right now. And the reason this moment feels different from the previous ones, the reason there is a quality to today that yesterday did not carry, is that you are passing the test in real time, in your actual life, without even fully realizing you are taking it. The silence protected you from receiving a version of the story that would have looked like what you wanted and cost you what you were still building. What you were building was your own ability to be in a connection without losing yourself to it, your ability to hold love without converting it into need, your ability to stay fully present to another person without disappearing into their emotional weather. You weren't there yet. You know that now. You can feel the distance between who you were in that longing and who you are in this quiet. The delay is not over because enough time passed. It is over because you genuinely became someone different. Not louder, not harder, more whole. The quiet you are sitting in now is not the quiet of someone waiting. It is the quiet of someone who arrived. There is something happening on the other side of the silence that you cannot fully see, but that does not mean nothing is there. Right now, someone connected to you is sitting at the edge of a truth they have been approaching for a very long time. They are not suppressing it. They are not rationalizing it away with a fresh set of reasons. They are simply, and this is the precise word, almost across the threshold of saying what they know, almost into the honesty that their whole interior has been building toward. They know. They have always known. Today is the day the knowing became too heavy to carry quietly. What the moon conjunct Neptune in Aries is doing to them right now is dissolving the last of the protective distance. Neptune does not ask permission to move through walls. It finds the gaps that already existed and widens them, slowly, completely, in the specific way that things which are ready to fall apart do. The story they have been telling themselves about why the timing wasn't right, about why the circumstances weren't aligned, about why the feeling needed more evidence before it could be acted on, that story is running out of material. Not because they decided to let it end, because Neptune is patient and stories that protect us from our own truth have a structural limit. This transit does not respect locked doors. Here is the physical reality of where they are right now. There are ordinary moments in their day. The pause before an email sends, the space between one task and the next, the specific quality of late afternoon when nothing particular is happening, and in those moments, something arrives that they did not choose. Not a general feeling, a specific recognition, a quality of knowing that has your particular shape. They try to redirect it, they give it something else to do, and it comes back faster than it left. The specific moment when their strategy stopped working was not dramatic. It was probably unremarkable from the outside. A Tuesday, a mundane stretch of time. And in the middle of it, the thought arrived with such calm and such weight that they could not convert it into anything more manageable. It was just true, and they sat with the truth of it longer than they had allowed themselves to before. They are not ready to act from that truth yet. The full weight of honesty, what it would require them to admit about themselves, about what they actually want, about what they have not yet said, is still being assembled, but the recognition is active. It is alive, and it is changing everything even as they stand still. They know. They have always known. Today is the day the knowing became too heavy to carry quietly. You are standing at a fork right now, not the dramatic kind, the quiet kind, the one where both directions look almost identical from the outside. The difference is entirely interior, and it is entirely everything. The fork in the road looks identical from the outside. The difference is entirely interior and entirely everything. One way of standing in this moment involves a specific quality of holding, not obvious tension, the more subtle kind, the background process of managing, the low-level monitoring that runs constantly, scanning for what might need to be anticipated, preparing for the next wave before the current one is finished. This is the part of you that has become very skilled at staying one step ahead of uncertainty, at pre-processing possible outcomes, so that when they arrive into a system that has already prepared a response. It is exhausting in the way that only constant readiness is exhausting, not dramatically, but without relief. There is a specific quality to this state, a kind of grip that lives in the hands before it reaches the mind, a shallowness in the breath that you don't notice until it changes. The other way of standing in this moment is different in quality rather than in volume. It does not arrive with announcement. It does not feel like triumph or relief, not at first. It feels like something being set down. The difference between carrying and not carrying, the shoulders settling without instruction, a breath that goes somewhere it couldn't reach before, not louder, cleaner, the specific sensation of being fully inside a moment rather than perpetually processing it in advance. This is not the universe withholding. This is the universe waiting to see which version of you steps forward. The soul is not asking you this question to create difficulty. It is asking because the answer determines the quality of everything that arrives next, not as punishment or reward, but as direction. What arrives into managed space arrives into a negotiation. What arrives into open space arrives into contact. Here is the question that separates these two internal states. Feel for this in the body, not in the mind. Are you holding this moment, or are you inside it? That question, held in the body rather than analyzed in the mind, will show you exactly where you actually are, not where you intended to be, not where you hope you are, where you are. Now go to the deepest layer. Because what this moment is really completing is not about what happens next with another person. It goes further back than that. There was a contract made, not with words, not in any moment you can point to, but at the level of the soul's agreement with its own experience. The contract was specific. This connection was going to teach you the difference between love and readiness, not whether you were capable of love. You were. Abundantly. The question was whether love and genuine readiness were arriving at the same time, in both people, in the form that allows something real to be built. The contract came to teach you that the right person at the wrong internal moment is still the wrong moment. That timing is not a logistics problem, it is a readiness problem, and readiness cannot be performed, it can only be real. You carried enormous love for someone who was not yet internally ready to meet it with their full presence. And here is the grief that deserves its own paragraph, its own space, its own honest weight. You did everything right. You loved well. You stayed open when closing would have been easier. You held the space with more care than most people bring to any connection, and it still wasn't enough to change the timing, because timing is not something love controls. Timing is something that each person arrives at through their own internal work, and no amount of love from outside accelerates that. That grief is real. The grief of loving well and still arriving at incompleteness is one of the specific human griefs that has no clean consolation. It simply is what it is, and it needs to be acknowledged fully before it can move. Saturn enforces these contracts not through punishment but through patience. The lesson closes not when enough time has passed, not when the pain has been survived, but when the truth of it has been genuinely integrated, when the viewer can hold the knowledge of what this was and feel the ground beneath them rather than flinching away from it. That is what completion feels like, not triumph. Ground. The contract was specific. Not forever, not even reunion, but the permanent, irreversible shift in how you understand what love requires of you. What this connection was always going to deliver was not a person who stayed. It was a version of you who no longer needs them to. What ends here is not the love. What ends is the version of the connection that could only exist while the lesson was still unfinished. The love, if it was real, does not require the dynamic to survive. The body knows this before the mind agrees to it, and it is already showing you, in the specific language of physical sensation, that the integration is underway. There is a quiet settling that has been arriving in you, and it is not numbness. You know the difference now. Numbness has a flatness to it, a muffled quality, a sense of things being slightly too far away. This is not that. This is an actual stillness that has no urgency behind it, a quiet in the chest that is not waiting for the next disruption, a quality of rest that feels unfamiliar specifically because it is not a rest you had to create. It arrived on its own because something finished. Sleep has been changing. not dramatically, but you may notice that it arrives earlier and leaves less residue in the first minutes of waking, that the quality of morning is different, that the first thought is not immediately weighted in the way it was, that there is, in the fraction of a second before full consciousness, a moment of neutral before the day's inventory arrives, that used to be occupied by the thing you were carrying. A name passes through your awareness now with a different quality than it had before. Not absent, but passing through the way weather passes through, present for a moment and then gone, without the body bracing around it the way it once did. Meals have a different quality. Not every meal, but the ones eaten without distraction, without filling the silence with something. There is a presence in those meals now that used to feel slightly effortful to access, as though the background frequency has lowered and what was always there beneath it is now audible. The anticipation that used to precede checking a phone, that specific quality of hoping and bracing at the same time, has been softening. Where it once arrived immediately and automatically, there are now moments of ordinary interaction with the phone that carry no weight at all. The body is learning that it does not need to be ready, and in conversation, with anyone, about anything, there is a quality of actual presence that has returned. Not the presence of someone performing engagement while running a separate internal process. Real presence. The kind that listens because it wants to, not because it's managing what it might miss. This is not the quiet of having given up. This is the quiet of something that has genuinely finished. The body knows the difference, even when the mind is still catching up. The mind catches up in its own time, but the body has already signed the completion papers, and what the body signs, the life begins to reflect. Something is settling into place, not just inside you, but around you. The decisions that used to require significant internal negotiation have been getting cleaner, not because your life simplified, because the internal conflict that used to accompany almost every significant choice has begun to dissolve at its level of origin, not case by case, but at the root. Where it once took effort to understand what you actually wanted, beneath the wanting that was shaped by fear, beneath the wanting that was shaped by hope, beneath the wanting that was shaped by what you thought you were supposed to want, it now takes less. There is a quality of self-knowledge arriving that doesn't require excavation. It is closer to the surface, quieter, more certain. The things that used to require a decision no longer do. The body has already made it. Quietly, without drama, without a moment you can point to, it simply stopped being available for certain costs. Situations that once felt exciting, the ones that carried a charge, a promise, a potential that kept you leaning forward, are now registering differently when they don't actually hold what they appear to hold. The charge arrives. The body reads it, and then, beneath the charge, the body reads what is actually there. And where there isn't depth, where the charge is surface and the substance is thin, the body is no longer interested. Not with judgment, simply without appetite. What used to feel like safety, the familiar, the predictable, the connection that didn't require anything to change, now registers as a ceiling, not a floor. The comfort that used to feel like enough now reveals itself as a lid on what is possible. And something in the way the external world responds to you is beginning to shift. Synchronicities are changing their character. What used to feel like nudges, signs trying to redirect you towards something you hadn't yet found, are beginning to feel like confirmations. As though the universe is no longer trying to guide you somewhere. It is simply reflecting back what you have already become. You are not waiting to become someone. The becoming already happened, in private, without announcement, in the exact window where it had to happen to be real. What is here now is not preparation, it is arrival. After this kind of completion, the nervous system recalibrates what it can house, not as a decision, as a biological fact about what is and is not compatible with the frequency you now carry. And certain things that were once available to this system are no longer available, not because you decided to be harder, because you cannot pretend anymore that certain things are enough. The pretending required energy you no longer have to spend on it. Being held at emotional arm's length by someone who knows exactly what they feel, who has full awareness of the truth and chooses consciously to keep it just far enough away from you that it never has to be acted on. Your nervous system can no longer accommodate that. It is not that you would leave immediately and without uncertainty. It is that the part of you that used to absorb that distance and call it patience has stopped being able to do the conversion. The gap between what is known and what is said is now legible to you in a way it wasn't before, and it registers not as something to wait out but as information about what is actually being offered. Carrying the full weight of a connection while the other person remains comfortable in its ambiguity, doing the emotional accounting for both people, tracking what is unsaid, managing the distance so that it never becomes a confrontation, that capacity is gone. Not as a wall, as a key that no longer fits a lock it once opened. You could insert it, but it doesn't turn. Something in the mechanism has changed, and the change is permanent. And explaining your depth to someone who uses your explanation as proof that you are too much, that particular dynamic has become structurally unavailable to this version of you. Because what you were actually doing in those moments was not explaining yourself. You were trying to earn the right to be received by someone who had already decided how much of you they were going to allow, and the part of you that believed the explanation would work. That part is complete. It has graduated from that particular lesson. What arrives now will either receive your depth without requiring justification, or it will not be given the space to decline. This is not hardness. This is discernment made permanent by experience. You did not close yourself. You clarified. And clarity does not reduce what is possible. It removes what was never going to be real anyway, and makes the remaining space available for what actually is. Now, if the person this chapter was about steps back into your field, this is the part that most people misread, and reading it accurately is everything. The question of whether they return is no longer the question that governs your interior, but the answer, when it arrives, will be legible, clearly, immediately, without the distortion of need bending the signal. If they return, the first thing you will notice is not whether you still feel something. You know the answer to that. What you will notice is something more specific, a quality of reading that has not been available to you before. Because in every previous version of this encounter, there was a distortion in the signal. On one side, the hope that wanted the return to mean transformation. On the other, the fear that made you brace before you could see clearly. Both of those things bent what arrived. The hope made partial presence look like fullness. The fear made genuine change look like a setup for repetition. Neither of those distortions is currently running at full strength, and what becomes possible in their absence is something simple but extraordinary. You can see what is actually there, not what you want to be there, not what you are afraid might be there. What is actually, precisely, there. If what returns is genuinely different, if the person who comes back is carrying real change rather than the feeling of return, your body will know before your mind forms a verdict. Something will settle rather than tighten. The quality of their presence will carry weight rather than performance. There will be a consistency to it that doesn't require you to track it, because consistent things don't need monitoring. And if what returns is the same version of the dynamic in new clothing, if the distance has simply been temporarily suspended rather than genuinely bridged, that will also be legible. The particular way old patterns announce themselves even when dressed in new language, the specific quality of someone who has missed the feeling without doing the work the feeling was asking them to do. If they do not return, what the absence confirms is this: the completion was yours. It was always yours. And the confirmation that arrives in the non-return is not loss. It is the universe showing you that what you completed inside yourself stands on its own, that it doesn't require their acknowledgement to be real. The ground you are standing on belongs to you regardless of who arrives on it. Both doors open onto something real now, not because the outcomes are equal, because you are no longer different people depending on which one walks through. That steadiness is the thing. That is everything. If something in this reached you, not just your mind, but somewhere quieter and more certain than that, do one thing right now. Like this video, not as a gesture, but as a mark you make for yourself, a record that you were present for this. Subscribe so what arrives in the next window finds you again. These transmissions build on each other, and what opens today connects directly to what becomes available next. And in the comments, write these words: I receive what is real. Say them out loud as you type them. For your nervous system, not for anyone reading. Words spoken with real intention complete something that silent scrolling leaves unfinished. And if someone in your life is standing at a threshold they cannot yet name, share this. You already know who. You have been waiting for permission, not from another person. from somewhere inside yourself, the part that kept wondering if the waiting was worth it, if the holding was real, if the quiet was preparation or just more delay. That permission has been building toward you across every day of this. Today, it arrives, not because the stars aligned in some external abstract way, but because you did the actual work that earned this moment, quietly, privately, without audience or confirmation. You stayed honest about what you saw when the comfortable interpretation was available. You held a standard you never announced. You refused the version of love that required you to make yourself smaller to receive it. The chapter that carries the weight of what was unfinished is closing, not with drama, not with a final confrontation, not with a symbolic event you can point to, with the specific quiet of something that has genuinely, fully, permanently completed its work. You are already on the other side of this line. You have been crossing it for longer than you realized. And now, you are allowed to stop waiting to be sure. You are already there. That is not a small thing to realize. It is, in fact, the whole thing. Because here is what most people miss about moments like this one. They keep looking for the arrival to feel like arrival. They expect it to announce itself with a changed circumstance, a dramatic shift in the external story, a clear signal from outside that the internal work has landed. And when the moment comes quietly, when it comes as a settling rather than a fanfare, they walk right past it. They are still looking at the horizon when what they came here for is already beneath their feet. You are not looking at the horizon anymore. Something in you has stopped scanning. That stopping, the specific quality of attention that is no longer perpetually aimed outward, waiting for confirmation to arrive from somewhere beyond you, is not emptiness. It is not giving up. It is the most significant internal shift a person can make, and it almost always goes unannounced. Nobody marks it. Nobody names it in the moment it happens. You simply notice, one ordinary day, that the constant outward lean has eased, that the question you were always running in the background, the one about whether you were enough, whether what you felt was returned, whether the story was going to resolve in your favor, has stopped requiring an answer. Not because you found the answer, because it stopped being a question. This is not detachment. This is arrival. And arrival changes what you are available for, not in theory, in practice, in the immediate and specific texture of your days. The conversations that happen now carry a different quality, not because you perform differently, because you are actually present in a way you were not before. The part of your attention that was always partially elsewhere, held by what was unresolved, occupied by the connection that hadn't completed, has returned. It is here now, in the room, in the body. In the actual moment you are moving through rather than the future moment you were preparing for. Other people feel this before they can name it. They do not know why a conversation with you lands differently than it did. They cannot point to what changed, but something in the quality of being met by you is different, fuller, stiller, more actual, because you are no longer half somewhere else. What the moon trine Jupiter is amplifying right now is this specific quality of presence, the emotional body in natural agreement with the expansive, generous force of what is possible. What that means in lived terms is that your emotional openness and your sense of what you deserve are pointing in the same direction for the first time in a long while. The heart is not fighting the knowing. The knowing is not overriding the heart. They have arrived at the same place through different roads and found each other there. That convergence is what makes this window different from the ones that came before it. You have felt open before. You have felt certain before. But feeling both at the same time, from the same ground, without the tension between them, that is new. And it is what the next chapter of your story gets built on. Not urgency, not hope dressed as certainty, actual convergence. The karmic chapter that carried the full weight of what was unfinished has not just paused, it has closed. Saturn, moving backward through the sign of the original self, has completed its audit of what was built here, what was real, what was borrowed, what was never actually yours to carry, and it has rendered its conclusion. The conclusion is not a verdict about whether you are worthy or unworthy, ready or unready, enough or not enough. The conclusion is simpler and more permanent than any of that. The lesson is complete. The contract has been honored. What needed to be known is known. What needed to be built is built. What needed to end has ended. Not with an event, but with a shift so deep it will not reverse. You are free. Not free as in unattached, not free as in indifferent, not free as in closed. Free as in no longer governed by the unfinished. Free as in the weight that was living in the background of every moment. The low, constant pressure of something unresolved has lifted, not because you lifted it, because it completed. And completion, when it is real, does not announce itself. It simply makes itself known in the quality of ordinary moments. A song that arrives and carries the right amount, not too much. A silence that settles instead of pressing. A morning that opens without the first thought being borrowed from a chapter that is already over. You will know it. You are already knowing it. That is why the sound that reached you today carried what it carried. Not too much, exactly enough. The exact weight of something ending cleanly and something else, quieter, more spacious, more genuinely yours, beginning.